The trouble with Harrowby Hall was that it was haunted. Even worse, the ghost did not appear only momentarily at the bedside of a witness, but its presence persisted for a whole mortal hour before disappearing. It was also saturated with seawater and drenched everything around it, appearing only on Christmas Eve as the clock was striking 12. The owners of Harrowby Hall had done their best to rid themselves of the damp and dewy spectre who rose up out of the best bedroom floor at midnight, but without success. They had tried stopping the clock so that the ghost would not know it was midnight, but she made her appearance just the same, standing there until everything about her was thoroughly saturated. Recently, the owners of Harrowby Hall had corked up every crack in the floor with hemp, over which were placed layers of tar and canvas. The walls, doors and windows were made waterproof in the belief that the unexorcised phantom would be unable to leak into the room, but even this did not suffice. The following Christmas Eve, she appeared as promptly as before, frightening the occupant of the room out of his senses by sitting alongside him and gazing with her cavernous blue eyes into his. In her long fluid fingers, bits of dripping seaweed were entwined, which she drew across his forehead until he became like one insane. He swooned away and was found unconscious in his bed by his host, simply saturated with seawater and fright. He never recovered, passing 4 years later of pneumonia and nervous exhaustion at the age of 78. The next year, Henry Oglethorpe, the master of Harrowby Hall, decided not to open the best spare bedroom at all, thinking that the ghost might be satisfied by simply haunting the furniture. It was later concluded that the ghost appeared as usual in the room by the dripping wet curtains and great damp spot on the ceiling of the room below. However, finding no one there, she immediately set about to haunt the owner of Harrowby himself. She found him in his own cosy room, drinking undiluted whiskey, then proceeded to drench his hair and overflow his whiskey bottle. The unexpected and terrifying sight of her cavernous eyes and seaweed fingers was such a shock that he fainted, only coming to due to the deluge of water. He attempted to seek dry clothes, but the spectre followed him, drenching him every time he moved. His effort to warm himself by the fire resulted in it being extinguished by the gush. Even his whiskey was no comfort, as it had been diluted to 90% water. Finally, he tried and communicate with the ghost, asking her to stop her infernal visits to his house. Couldn't she simply stay out in the lake area instead of saturating his possessions inside? In a gurgling voice, the ghost sadly informed him that she was impelled to haunt his place year after year by inexorable fate. She explained that it gave her no pleasure to enter the house, ruin and mildew everything she touched, but it was her doom over 200 years to that very night. She explained that she was his ancestor and the ghost of a fair maiden whose picture hangs over the mantelpiece in the drawing room. Her father had built Harrowby Hall and, to spite her, had furnished her room in garish colours. When the spirited young woman declined to live in the room, he told her to live on the lawn outside. That night she ran from the house and impulsively jumped from the cliff into the sea. There a sea nymph came to her and made her a follower, adding that her doom was to haunt Harrowby Hall every Christmas Eve for 1 hour throughout the rest of eternity. If the room was not inhabited, she was to spend the allotted hour with the head of the house. Oglethorpe immediately stated that he would sell the house, but the ghost replied that she was also required to appear to any purchaser as the deeds were being delivered and divulge the awful secret of the house. A year later, Oglethorpe was in his grave, having never recovered from the cold he contracted that night. With Harrowby Hall closed, the apparition appeared to his son and heir in London, ruining everything in his rooms. His clocks were rusted throughout, and a collection of watercolour paintings entirely obliterated by the onslaught of the water ghost. Even worse, the apartments below his were drenched with the water, soaking through the floors. He was compelled to pay for the damage, and his landlady requested him to vacate the premises immediately. The story of his family's visitation spread, and his social life declined. The first thought of the young man was to make someone else occupy the haunted room during the crucial hour. However, all of his servants refused, none of his friends would agree, and in fact there was not to be found in all England someone so poor as to be willing to occupy the doomed chamber on Christmas Eve for pay. That year he had extensive steam pipes installed in the room and prepared himself by regularly attending a Turkish bath for 6 months prior to Christmas. However, as hot as the haunted room was, it shortened the aquatic spirit's visit by no more than 5 minutes, and as the water ghost sizzled out on the floor, she whispered that there was water in great plenty where she came from. Frustratingly, the massive heat and evaporation warped and cracked the chamber so much that a large sum of money had to be outlaid to remedy the damage. The following year, the Oglethorpe heir had another idea. He donned a warm suit of fur underclothing over which he placed a tight-fitting rubber garment. This was covered by another set of wool underclothing, covered by another layer of rubber. Placing a light and comfortable diving helmet over his head, he awaited the coming of his tormentor on Christmas Eve. It was a bitterly cold night, the air outside below zero, as he lay on the bed in the haunted room. There was a sudden banging of doors as a blast of cold air swept through the hall. The door leading into the haunted chamber flew open, a splash was heard, and the water ghost was instantly standing beside the heir of Harrowby. Although from his outer dress streamed rivulets of water, he was as dry and warm as he could have wished, due to his layers of undergarments. The young man suggested that they go out on the lake, to which the spectre responded that he couldn't get rid of her that way, that the water would not swallow her up, but just add to her present bulk. But he insisted, to the ghost's strange reluctance. They had not got far outside when she showed signs of distress, claiming her limbs were stiff with cold. He then seated himself on a snowdrift as the water ghost quickly started to freeze. Her overskirt became a solid sheet of ice, and she pleaded with Oglethorpe to light a fire. He replied coldly that she had drenched his family for 203 years, and tonight would be the last occasion for that. She cried out threateningly that when she thawed out, she would no longer be genially tepid, but ice-cold water. It was then that Oglethorpe unveiled his plan. When the water ghost was frozen solid, he would be sending her to a cold storage warehouse to remain an icy work of art forevermore. The warehouse would never burn down, as some do, as it was made of asbestos with fireproof walls. As the water ghost tried to plead further with Oglethorpe, the words froze on her lips and the clock struck 1. The moon shone down on the rigid figure of a beautiful woman sculpted in clear, transparent ice. There stood the ghost of Harrowby Hall, conquered by the cold and a prisoner for all time, and which still stands today in a large storage house in London. Never again would the spectre flood the house of Oglethorpe with woe and seawater.